Now, before we dive into hosting providers and available options we got there, I want to stick to the web server topic which we discussed in the last lecture. As mentioned, Django is no web server, but Django, of course, does handle incoming requests once they reach Django forwarded from the web server. But there are two kinds of requests which are not handled by default, and that are requests for static files or user uploads, though user uploads in the end, once uploaded, are again just static files. So in the end, it's just static files which are not handled by Django. It does not serve such files automatically. So if you have a project, as we have it, with static files like this app CSS file here, or also in the app folder, the static files like an image or more CSS code, these files, if a request is targeting such a file, that request will fail. By default, that request will fail because if a request is for such a file and it then reaches Django, so if a web server forwards such a request to Django, then Django won't do anything for that request. It won't find these files here. Now, during development, of course, it did. We had no problems adding CSS there. The reason for that is that our development server, which we started with manage py run server, actually does serve static files. But that's a simplification built into that server, which does not exist for production. There, by default, Django does not serve static files. So we'll need to solve this problem. And that's a limitation or something we need to solve, which exists on purpose. Because it turns out that when it comes to serving static files, there's a lot of optimization potential. And if Django would serve those files by default, it would serve them in an inefficient way by default. That's why we need to make sure that those files are being served, and that's why we'll have different options for that. Option 1 will be that we configure Django to serve such files by working on the urls.py file. That's in the end what we already did for uploaded files, which again are just static files. We needed to do this even during development because those uploaded files wouldn't be picked up by Django. And we can also do this for all the other static files like CSS files and so on. So we can configure Django to serve such files as well, so to override the default where it does not serve such files. And this is okay for smaller sites, but you should be aware that this is not performance optimized, because handling those static files, just like any other incoming request, like a request for a template to be rendered or for some data to be stored, is simply not optimal. You can serve static files in a better way, but to get started, this approach, just like sticking to SQLite, is okay, and not everybody is building the next Facebook. So the performance disadvantages you might have here might simply not matter to you. Now, a better approach, however, will often be to not let Django serve those files, but instead to configure a web server to serve those files and the Django app separately. So that means that our web server, which we need to install anyways, does forward certain requests to Django, but if it detects that a request is going for an image stored in a specific folder or is going for a CSS file, then it should forward that request to our static file folder instead. And that then still is on the same server, it's still on the same device, but separate processes are being used for serving such static files and for handling other kinds of requests, and that already should be better for performance. Another option would be that we use a dedicated service, a dedicated machine for serving those static and uploaded files, so that we have one device and server for our Django application, and that device and server will then only take care about incoming requests that want a page or that submit form data. And whenever a static file is requested, so whenever the CSS file for a page is needed, that request would go to a totally different machine and would fetch the file from there. And that's also something you can implement and you can build. And there, the initial setup will be more complex, but it typically offers the best possible performance because there are services which focus entirely on serving static files, and those services are then highly optimized for this purpose. Now, in this course section, we are going to see all three approaches, and I'll show you all three approaches. You should be aware of those differences though, so that you are able to choose the option which makes the most sense to you.